Hi, my name is Beth and welcome to my April 2024 Reading Journal Wrap-Up. I'm starting with my monthly cover page. In 2024, I've been cutting out pieces of paper to glue onto each side, and that's really all the decorating these pages get. Last year, I decorated each side of the page with stickers and labels, but I decided not to do that this year because if I read more than 3 books in 1 month, it was a hassle to try and fit all of the labels on one page. So I decided to try just doing plain monthly cover pages. While it certainly takes less time and effort, I'm not sure if I like it. I was into it back in January, but I feel like they just look a bit boring. I still like having the quotes, but I don't know if I love the setup. But for now, it is what it is. The quote that I chose for April was, "I have never known such a wondrous thing in all my life as you." This is a quote from Circe by Madeline Miller. I read Circe last month, and even though I didn't really care for the book, I can still appreciate a good quote when I see one. I'm just finishing up by adding the month to the right-hand side, but with that, the cover page is done. The first book I read in April was Coraline by Neil Gaiman. One of my reading goals for 2024 is to embrace rereading. I rarely reread books because I have this mentality that I need to read as many books as I possibly can, which I know is unrealistic, but I strive for it anyway. So this year, I'm trying to revisit stories I've already read to see if I have new perspectives on them. And for me, Coraline felt like a perfect candidate for this. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with Coraline, but this book is about a girl named Coraline who moves into an apartment with her parents. Coraline's parents are incredibly busy and they don't seem to really understand their daughter. So Coraline spends most of her time just wandering around the house and visiting her eccentric neighbors. Coraline discovers a door in her house that leads to an alternate version of her home. All of the people and things in this new world are the same, except that they are all fabulous, fantastical versions of themselves, and all of the people have button eyes. When Coraline's other mother tries to get her to stay, the dark intentions of the other side become apparent, and Coraline has to fight to stay alive and save her real parents. The graphic novel, and especially the movie, used to terrify me as a kid. And speaking of the movie, I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion or not, but I find the film adaptation of this story to be superior to the novel. I am aware that this could just be a me issue. I have a very complicated relationship with Neil Gaiman's books. I've read 4 of his books, 3 of which I have read twice now, but I've only enjoyed one of them, The Graveyard Book. I've also read The Ocean at the End of the Lane and The Sleeper and the Spindle, but I just don't seem to like his books like everyone else does. And I reread Coraline because I was hoping that I would enjoy it more the second time around, but it was not a successful experience. I would say that my biggest issue with Coraline is the pacing. The beginning of this book is meant to show how boring Coraline's life is. There are no other kids around, so she's all alone. And her parents don't let her play out in the rain, so she's stuck either inside the apartment or visiting Miss Forcible and Miss Spink next door. There's nothing for her to do, so of course she's bored. But reading this was also incredibly boring. A character who wants to do things but gets constantly rejected gets stale pretty quickly. And so because we take so long to establish Coraline's boring life, when the beldam offers Coraline the ability to stay in the other world on her first visit, of course it seems jarring. I'm not surprised that Coraline says no. Yes, she's bored, but she isn't stupid. This is an aspect that I think the movie does better. Coraline is very fairy tale-like, and it's clear that Neil Gaiman uses fairy tale elements in the story. One of the most popular fairy tale tropes is things happening in threes, and Gaiman does use this in Coraline. There are 3 neighbors, 3 of the 4 apartments are occupied, and there are 3 marbles to find. So why not use it even further and make Coraline visit the other world 3 times before the beldam makes her offer? To me, this just makes a little more sense. I could see the beldam's plan working on a child who's 5, but not an 11-year-old like Coraline. I decorated this spread using a Snow White sticker sheet from an Etsy seller called Artimation 1104. It felt very fitting to use a fairy tale sticker sheet for a fairy tale-like book. I also ended up using a washi tape from Marigonasuli Art. I thought that the orange fall design of the washi tape fit really well with the rest of the theme. I also find the last third of this book to wrap up very conveniently. When Coraline makes her deal with the beldam to find her parents and the souls of the lost children, she really sets herself up for failure with a near impossible task. But because she has the Hagstone, the entire scavenger hunt is unbelievably easy. Even when she retrieves the second marble from Miss Forcible and Miss Spink, their bodies are attached to the wall and their dogs don't chase after Coraline. There's no threat. There's no real sense of urgency. It just doesn't seem like the stakes are that high. Every time I pick up a Neil Gaiman book, I wonder if it will be my last. If anyone is a fan of Neil Gaiman and you have a recommendation for me, I would love to hear it. Or should I just accept the fact that I might be a lost cause? I recently watched Good Omens, and admittedly, it's been very tempting to pick up the book, but I just don't want to be disappointed again. I ended up giving Coraline 2.5 stars. I think the magic and the whimsy of the story are great, but I just found myself frustrated. The next book I read was Thinner by Stephen King. One of my reading goals this year is to read at least 2 Stephen King books. This is actually a goal I have for myself every year. For the most part, I tend to enjoy his books, but because he has so many, I try and force myself to read at least 2 every year, so I keep on top of them. I've been able to stick to this goal every year since becoming an active reader, except for last year. I didn't read a single Stephen King book last year because I just wasn't in the mood for one at any point in the year. I try not to let mood reading get too much in the way, but I completely dropped the ball with this goal last year. So after about 1.5 years, I can finally mark another King book as read. Thinner follows a lawyer named Billy Halleck who, just before the book begins, has hit an elderly woman with his car, resulting in her death. However, because Billy is a lawyer and has a lot of connections, he manages to escape any punishment as a result. What Billy doesn't realize is that the woman he hit was part of a traveling group of Romani people, so when the accident is deemed as entirely the woman's fault, the woman's father puts a curse on Billy that causes him to lose weight. Billy starts at 250 pounds, but rapidly loses weight every day despite his unchanging eating habits. So he tries to find a way to reverse the curse before it kills him. A lot of King fans tend to believe that old King is better than new King. While generally I think there's an argument to be made for that, Thinner was released in 1984, and I find it to be very mediocre. The atmosphere of the town is really good. King excels at writing small town stories, and this is no exception. I find all the people to have a lot of life in them. I'm not surprised that Billy is able to get away with vehicular manslaughter without any charge because I believe in the people in this town. Seeing the relationships and the personalities of the characters allows for the situation to feel believable. I also think the horror is well done. It's a slow burn body horror, and the language used to describe both the look and the feeling of someone fading away is quite startling. However, the pacing in this book is messy. There's a section of the book where Billy goes on this big goose chase, and it lasts for so long. And there's very little progression happening, so we're just watching him go from place to place with little to no gain. There's a character named Richard in this book. He's an old friend of Billy's. Halfway through the book, Richard basically becomes the main character, which I thought was an odd choice. King takes all the agency and action from Billy and gives it to Richard. So we get these long sections of Richard telling Billy all the things that he's been up to. As a reader, it's really frustrating because we aren't there during the action. We're just hearing Richard tell Billy about it afterwards. On top of being an average book, Thinner did not age well. At all. This book repeatedly uses outdated terms for Romani people and really plays on stereotypes, such as Romani people being mischievous, sexualized, and able to curse others, which is literally the plot of this book. Obviously, I know we have to look at literature based on when it was published, but reading this in retrospect, it's very unforgiving in its approach. I went for this dainty pink theme for this spread, which does feel very weird, but it's kind of funny as well. I used a woodland princess sticker sheet from Jolico and paired it with a print of a vase and a mermaid from Sibylline Maynette. Thinner was originally published under Stephen King's pseudonym Richard Bachman. I have only ever read one other Bachman book, and it was The Long Walk. I really enjoyed The Long Walk. It was different and very engaging, but Thinner felt like a Stephen King book to me. Maybe I haven't read enough Bachman books to be able to notice a difference, but it really felt like Stephen King in every way. The prose, the dialogue, the environment. It was nice to be able to read another King after taking a long break from his books, but I gave Thinner 3 stars. I think its strengths are good, but the weaknesses are just a little bit stronger. The third book I read was The Sunshine Court by Nora Sakovich. This is a book that I don't think anyone expected to ever come into existence. I know the announcement of this book shocked a lot of people, including myself. I was excited that we were getting another book in this series, but I was also hesitant because it had been so long and the trilogy felt very final. I wasn't sure if there was much more to say beyond what we already knew, but I'll be the first to tell you I was wrong. The Sunshine Court is a direct continuation of All for the Game, so it picks up right where the third one finishes. However, we are no longer following the main POV character from the original trilogy, Neil, and are instead following dual perspectives from 2 minor characters we met earlier in the series. The first character is Jean, and he is an Exe player for the Edgar Allan Ravens. But following an unfortunate incident, he ends up being traded to another team and begins attending school across the country. In classic All for the Game fashion, Jean has a lot of trauma associated with his old team and school, and so he struggles to adapt and learn a new lifestyle. The other character we follow is Jeremy, and he is Jean's new team captain. He's a very happy-go-lucky guy and someone his whole team trusts. He tries to find a balance between doing what is right for Jean, someone who desperately needs a friend, and doing what is right for the team. The two work together alongside new friends to rebuild a new future before Jean's past sneaks up on him. I think anyone who has read the original trilogy will tell you that it's not the greatest. It's so weird because the series has tons of fans, but it is those fans who will tell you that there are better books out there. The writing is a bit weak, the events in the books really require you to suspend your disbelief, and all three of the books are filled with extremes. And yet, I think people enjoy this series because it's fast-paced, action-packed, and there's a really strong found family aspect. This book is similar in that regard, and I'll tell you right now, I really enjoyed it. When I rate books, I assess my overall enjoyment as well as craft elements, but with this series, I feel like the craft analysis just goes right out the window, and I base my opinions exclusively on how much fun I'm having. This book is a slow burn, and it's occasionally lacking some plot, but I think that fans of the original series will really enjoy it. One of the things I really liked about this book was the decision to pull away from the original main characters. It's not that I don't like them, but like I said earlier, I wasn't sure if there was much more to add to their stories. I thought that shifting the focus to these minor characters was a smart choice because it opens new opportunities. And I liked the contrast between Jean and Jeremy. Jean is very moody all of the time, but I mean, it's understandable. He has a lot going on. And Jeremy is just a sweetheart. He is so kind and incredibly patient with everyone's needs. They give off a grumpy sunshine dynamic, which I think makes the reading experience enjoyable. There's also a handful of new characters introduced, and I think two of them in particular, Layla and Kat, are really great additions. I will say that sometimes it felt like there were some things being rehashed from the original trilogy. For example, in the Foxhole Court, Neil has all his belongings in one duffel bag, and everybody comments on it. In a very similar fashion, Jean arrives in California with a single carry-on suitcase. It feels strange to be decorating a page for a book called The Sunshine Court with this brown vintage style, but that's what we're going with. I used an antique shop sticker sheet from Starjoy Studios. I also used a washi tape from the Aesthetic Studio along with some brown craft paper I got from my local dollar store. Overall, I liked this book. I'm rating it purely on my own enjoyment and a bit of nostalgia, but I gave The Sunshine Court 4 stars. I don't know when the next book comes out, but I'm excited to see how the series wraps up for a second time. The next book I read was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I first read Vicious back in 2021 and I absolutely loved it. It was my first V.E. Schwab book and I thought it was a great introduction to her work. At the time, I had thought about reading Vengeful, but I remember reading the description of the book and thinking that it sounded like it was going in a very different direction than Vicious, so I never ended up reading it. But a little while ago, a friend told me that she read Vengeful and that it wasn't actually that different and it still followed Victor and Eli, so it made me reevaluate my interest in the series, and I figured it had been a while since I'd read Vicious, and I was probably due for a reread. Vicious takes place over 2 timelines, one in the present day and one 10 years prior. In the past, 2 university roommates, Victor and Eli, decide to focus their final projects on the study of EOs, or extraordinary people. They determine that EOs get their superhuman abilities as a result of near-death experiences, so they decide to experiment on themselves to both prove their hypotheses as well as gain superhuman-like powers. In the present day, Victor has just broken out of jail and is on a manhunt for Eli, who has been using his abilities to kill others. Victor and Eli's relationship has changed a lot over 10 years, and they have a lot of history rooted in hate. So they try and find ways to stop each other until only one man is left standing. What I strive for with my rereads is that moment when you realize the book is just as good, if not better, than the first time you read it. That is the experience I had rereading Vicious. I think this book has a lot of really great aspects to it, my favorite being the dynamic between Victor and Eli. They go from roommates, classmates, and scholars to enemies in such a short amount of time. And while I think the book wants you to think that they are friends turned enemies, I'm not so convinced they were ever really friends. There's a lot of jealousy rooted in their relationship, particularly from Victor's side. It seems like the main thing Victor is getting from their friendship is the feeling of being superior to someone else, which is an awful reason to be friends with someone. I find their switch into hatred to be believable because there's always been flaws. They remind me a lot of Jean and Phineas from A Separate Piece by John Knowles. It has that same dynamic of jealous roommate takes things into his own hands and everything just goes out of control. I also really enjoyed Victor's relationships in the present day. He has a friend from prison, Mitch, who travels around with him, and the two of them take in a young girl named Sydney. The three of them have this weird domestic work relationship. Victor is using both Mitch and Sydney to get the upper hand on Eli, but at the same time, he does care for both of them and their safety. And Mitch and Sydney have this very cute father-daughter-like relationship. It's very sweet, and I loved reading about them. I used a sticker sheet from an Etsy seller called Lunaria Stickers to decorate this spread. I paired it with a purple washi tape from Marigona Suli Art and this beautiful butterfly paper that I got from Michaels. One of the more interesting things about this book is Eli's God complex. Eli passes off his killings as God's work. He claims that if God doesn't want him to continue, he'll make him stop. I find this very interesting considering Eli's existence as an EO. His powers were created through scientific study and experimentation. Many people regard science as being in opposition to religion. I find it fascinating that Eli uses his science abilities in the name of God. Additionally, Eli's powers contradict God because they defy the traditional pattern of human life. It's an interesting detail that I think speaks a lot to Eli's delusion. I loved Vicious just as much the second time as I did the first. I'm really glad that I took the time to reread it because there were a lot of things that I forgot about, and I think I set myself up a lot better for Vengeful. I gave Vicious 5 stars. I think it's a really great story on jealousy and rivalry on an extreme but also kind of fun level. Naturally, next up is Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. I thought about waiting a little bit before picking this up, but I was just too excited. I'm filming the last 2 setups at a different table because I actually moved. I finished my undergrad, so I've moved back to my hometown for a bit until I start grad school. So if the next few videos feature inconsistent locations, that's why. Like I said, I originally wanted to wait a bit before continuing this series, but I enjoyed my reread so much that I just couldn't wait to find out what happened next. Vengeful takes place 5 years after the end of Vicious. It sees the return of almost all the characters from the first book, along with new additions. Everyone seems to be in a rough place. Victor's powers aren't working properly. Eli is being forced to work alongside the police with tight restrictions, and Sid is caught between trusting Victor, making new friends, and moving past the ordeal with Eli and Serena. And for the first time, it seems as though Victor and Eli share a common enemy, a new threat by the name of Marcella, who is rising up in the ranks of EOs and causing destruction wherever she goes. Like I mentioned during my thoughts of Vicious, I was initially hesitant about picking this up because I thought the synopsis was implying that Marcella was the new main character and Victor and Eli weren't going to be in the book either as much or at all. But to my enjoyment, Victor and Eli were still very much at the forefront of this book. Their dynamic was my favorite aspect of the first book, so I wanted that energy continued. There are definitely other characters that we follow, but most of the story follows characters we met in the first book. While reading Vicious, I would have told you that Victor was my favorite character. I found him to have a lot of passion, which resulted in him having a lot of action in the book. Whereas in this book, I feel like there are more Eli chapters than Victor chapters. At first, I wasn't sure how I felt about that, but I ended up quite enjoying Eli's story. Like Vicious, Vengeful features flashbacks. Eli's flashbacks take place during his upbringing and during his time at Lockland, both of which I found to be really interesting. Eli's backstory offered a lot more insight into his faith and his strong religious beliefs. Interestingly, though, Eli experiences a lot of trauma as a child, which makes his firm beliefs a bit shocking. I feel like when people have religious-based trauma, they eventually turn away from faith, but in Eli's case, it almost causes his faith to become stronger, which really goes to show just how deep and flawed his God complex is. Additionally, I enjoyed seeing the time at university from his perspective. It was fun to get to see Victor from someone else's view and see how stern he really was and how maybe he was always destined for antagonism. I used a sticker sheet from Marigona Sully Art to decorate this spread. I kept it pretty simple, but I still think this spread turned out nice. Even though I was a bit hesitant at first, I didn't mind reading about the new characters, Marcella and June. I thought they both had unique powers and brought exciting problems with them. The only part of the book that I didn't really care for was the very end. There are some aspects of the ending that are left open-ended, so I can't say for sure, but it feels like there isn't anywhere left to go for Victor or Eli. And I know there are other characters in this series, characters I like, but Victor and Eli are the driving force of my interest. The ending of this book felt pretty final, but it was also a bit unsatisfactory. Ultimately, though, it wasn't enough of a dislike to drop my rating. I think I enjoyed Vicious a little bit more, but I still really enjoyed this book. I gave Vengeful 5 stars. It was fast-paced, and it's going to be tough having to wait for the final book. The 6th and final book I read in April was Better Than the Movies by LePen Marker. Okay. I feel like things were going pretty well in April, and of course, things went completely downhill with this book. Better Than the Movies is about a high school senior named Liz. She is a hopeless romantic and she loves rom-coms. She fantasizes about the perfect meet-cute and believes that her love life is one destined for the screen. When a boy Liz used to be in love with, Michael, returns to town after 5 years, Liz makes it her mission to have Michael fall in love with her. But in order to do that, she enlists the help of her neighbor, Wes, whom she cannot stand. However, as the fake dating ensues, Liz starts to question who her true love really is. I want to start off by saying that I am aware that I am not the target audience for this book. Better Than the Movies is a YA romance. I don't gravitate towards YA much anymore, and I find the current romance book industry cares more about quantity than quality. So even though I read the occasional YA and the occasional romance, I don't read them very often. I actually almost DNF'd this book 10% in. The only reason I finished it was because it was selected for a book club that I'm in with a few friends, but I feel like my whole experience with this book could be summed up as it was, in fact, not better than the movies. I knew I wasn't going to like this book on page 2 when there was Colin Firth slander. But honestly, this whole book just felt immature and illogical. It's a YA novel, but it feels like a middle grade. And I know that YA technically starts at 12, but the writing just made it feel like it was for 10-year-olds. And I had so many issues with the plot of this book. To me, it genuinely makes no sense. Liz likes Michael, so she decides to fake date Wes. Why would Michael become more interested when Liz becomes unavailable? And even if he bought the whole fake dating thing, when they decide to fake break up, why would Michael immediately go for his only friend's ex? I think this book could have worked a lot better had it not included a fake dating trope and just had Liz getting Wes to be her wingman. I feel like fake dating works when it benefits the characters outside of the couple, but this just made no sense. And I really disliked Liz as a main character. I found her to be quirky to the point of being annoying. I think Liz would consider herself to be not like other girls, and that's not a compliment. She is so incredibly naive about love and expects her life to be exactly like a movie. She chooses not to tell her best friend about anything going on with Michael and Wes, so she single-handedly ruins her friendship. And it's not like she has a good reason for not telling her, she just refuses to talk to her. Also, I just don't find this book to be original in any way. It exists on a number of tropes, but again, it uses them very poorly. This is a story I've seen many times before, and it doesn't take any opportunities to subvert expectations. And I think the sheer implausibility of the plot makes it really hard to just enjoy it as a cute, fun read. I gave Better Than the Movies 1 star. I just really did not enjoy this book. And that is it for my April reading journal wrap-up. My reading this month was all over the place. I used every star on the rating scale this month. So I had some really good stuff and some really not good stuff. And even though I didn't make any progress on my TBR this month, I did make good progress on my other goals. I had wanted to squeeze in more reads this month, so overall, I'm really happy with April. Going into May, though, I'm feeling a little less optimistic. I've already started and DNF'd a book from my TBR list, and I started another book from my TBR, but I don't know if I'll be continuing with that one either. It's a really long book though, and I'm only a few percentages in, so I'm willing to give it a little more time. So I'm not anticipating that May will be an incredible reading month, but we'll see. Anyways, thank you very much for watching. Have a great rest of your day.